Thank you everybody for joining us this is the fourth or fifth talk that we host over the past 2 weeks. Am I audible to everybody? Yes, okay, so thanks again for joining us. My name is Sultan Su'ud Al-Qasmi, and it's a great honor to have all of you here. We've had a great turnout, over 200 people signed up for this talk. So obviously there is a great deal of interest in what will happen economically, at least in the next few months. And I can't think of anyone better than our guest tonight, and I'll be introducing him in a minute or so. Before then, I'd like to remind you that you can make use of the chat window that's on the side. So you could write your questions, and I will be reading from the questions throughout the next hour. Please do try to include your full name and your affiliation if you like, so that I can introduce your question properly to our speaker. Before we start, I want to tell you what the format will be like. For over the next hour, our guest will be speaking about three different segments. So the first segment of the talk will be about the virus and the economic impact and policy response. So what's been the economic impact of this virus, and what have the countries done in the region in order to mitigate the effects of this virus? That's part one, the virus and its effect. Part two is a big deal for us because it's about the decline of the price of oil. So part one, virus; part two, oil; and part three, what is the long-term impact of what's happening here? When are we going to see a return to normal economic behavior? And so I want to say also thanks to the people who recommended that I host Ziad, my friend, architect Riyad Jokka, and Financial Times reporter Simeon Kerr, both suggested that we host Ziad. So thanks a lot for that. And please do keep your suggestions coming, because this is a platform for all of you. So Ziad, without further ado, I will introduce you. So Ziad Daoud is the chief Middle East economist for Bloomberg Economics. He holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics and a BSc from the University College of London. Ziad lives in the UAE, although he is of Iraqi origin. And so I'm taking this opportunity to also send you my condolences on the passing of the great Iraqi architect, Rafat Chaderji, also one of the most impactful people of our decade, of our era. Ziad, I will hand over to you. So I'm giving you sharing privileges. You will take over the screen. Everybody, you might have to enlarge your screen to see Ziad's presentation, and do write your questions, and then we will stop him every 10 minutes in order to ask him questions.
Sure. So thank you very much.
Oops.
Let me just share the screen first. So thank you so much, Sultan, for the presentation. I saw a few people in the chat saying I wasn't audible enough. So if I'm not audible, write down and just tell Sultan, and he'll tell me off. But yeah, thank you, Sultan, for inviting me, for hosting this, for being a wonderful host, both in real life and in virtual life. And thank you to Riyad and Simeon for the suggestion. So what I'm going to do is, as Sultan mentioned, I'm going to talk about, we have the GCC is facing basically two major forces. One of them is the virus, like the rest of the world. And secondly is the decline in oil prices, which is very influential here in the GCC. So I'm going to talk about the virus first and its impact, economic impact. I'm going to then talk about oil, and then I'm going to talk about the long-term sort of the economic development, if you like, for the region, and then we'll interrupt in the middle. I think before we start also, it's also useful to express some humility. No one saw this coming. I think even at the best of times, our knowledge is limited by what we study, the people that we interact with, and our experience. And now under a lockdown, under social distancing, our knowledge is even, less, we know even less. So please, if you disagree with something, if you see things differently, if you have different views, please share and shout. If you agree, please shout even louder. I like people who agree with me. So let me start with the impact of the virus. So First, let's get some quick numbers in. We do have about 1.7 million people in the world who have the virus, 1.7 million confirmed cases. We have over 100,000 deaths globally, which is sad. In the region, we have about over 130,000 cases, confirmed cases of the virus. Most of these cases are in Iran and Turkey, but they're also elsewhere. And we have over 5,000 deaths. In the GCC, the number of cases is about 12,000 with about 79 deaths. Now, these numbers change every day. So these numbers are as of the 10th of April. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the virus is still spreading, what is called flattening the curve. We haven't reached the peak of the curve yet. The numbers are still rising, which is unfortunate. The second thing is the fatality rate, because global fatality rate is about 6%. So 6% of the confirmed cases end in death. But this fatality rate varies by country and by region. And you can see here in the region, we have very different rates across different countries. So in the GCC, the rate is low, it's below 1%, but we have certain countries with high fatality rate, like Egypt, Iran, and Iraq, with fatality rate above 5% of confirmed cases. Now, that might reflect the fact that these countries are testing less. If you're testing fewer number of cases, discovering fewer number of cases, you'll end up with an inflated number for fatality rate. It could reflect different quality of the health system, but it could also reflect the fact when you have a pandemic, it's much more difficult to control it when you have a bigger country than we have a smaller one. So that's what we know about the virus, and that's all I'm going to say in terms of the epidemiology of the virus. How has the virus impacted the region? The short answer is the region is not the best in terms of data provision. So we don't know exactly what is happening right now to the economy. But I'm going to use a principle, a theory of knowledge principle that our ancestors used, what our old Arab Islamic ancestors called qiyas al-shahid ala al-ghaib, which is basically measuring what is unknown with what is known, approximating what is absent with what is present. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at what's happening in the global economy, other countries which are basically imposing the same lockdown measures, and seeing what the economic impact on these countries are. So here it is. So what we're seeing here is basically what has happened to the global economy. The global economy is likely now to be in a recession. What does that mean? It means that we're producing less today and consuming less today than what we used to 2 or 3 months ago. So that's basically the case. The global economy is likely to be in a recession now. Now, there are two questions here. The first question is, how deep is this recession likely to be? And the second question is, how long will it take? We have a better answer for the first one. We can answer the first one with more conviction than the second one. So in terms of the depth of the recession, what we know is that this recession is likely to be deep. So French statisticians who have access to real-time data, credit card, electricity consumption, surveys from businesses, they tell us that a third of the economy is basically shut down when you had the lockdown. So you're losing a third of your output, you're losing a third of your consumption with every month of lockdown. You'd expect the same dynamics to be in place here. If you look at US data, and if you look at unemployment data in the US, we know that in the last 3 weeks, 17 million people in the US have lost their jobs and are applying for unemployment benefits. This is what is called initial jobless claims, and this is weekly data. We've had 17 million people have applied for that in the last 3 weeks. To put this number into perspective, this means 1 in 9 employed people in the US has lost their jobs. And that's a horrific number. That is eye-poppingly large. That's unprecedented. We have not seen anything like this before. The third way to just realize the extent of the slowdown and the depth of the slowdown is to compare this crisis, which is global in nature, to past crises. So the last global crisis that we've had was the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, which started in the US and spread to the rest of the world. That crisis caused a recession. In the US, it caused a recession for 1.5 years, from the beginning of 2008 to the middle of 2009. During this recession, the US lost 5% of its output. So basically, if the size of the US economy was 100 at the beginning of 2008, it ended up with 95 in the middle of 2009. It lost 5% of its output. How does that compare to the current situation? Well, we might be losing, or the US might be losing 5% of its output in 3 months. So the global financial crisis, which lasted for a year and a half, will be, will have the intense impact of that, the full impact of that in 3 months between April and end of June, which is significant. Let's just also get some perspective on this. The global financial crisis was not a normal recession. It was a big recession. It changed the way we think about economics. It changed the way policymaking was done. It had long-term ramifications. It's actually, its other name is the Great Recession. So we're having the full impact of the Great Recession in 3 months. That's what's happening in the global economy. That is likely to happen here because we have the same strict measures to contain the virus. We have lockdown, we have curfews, we have schools are shut, we have flights are suspended. So that's the depths of the recession. It's likely to be very deep. It's probably the deepest downturn on record. Now it's the next question, which is basically how long will this last for? And there are two schools of thought here. There's one school of thought that says, well, you know what? This recession is not coming because we have economic imbalances. It's not because we have a bubble in the housing market, or we have a bubble in the stock market, or because we're importing too much, or because the government has borrowed too much. This recession is happening because we have a global pandemic that's forcing us to stay at home, to work from home, and naturally we're less productive from home, and to consume less. But once this pandemic is contained, once the containment measures are lifted, we'll go back to work and we'll go back to normal. There has been no destruction to our offices. We could go back to work and produce immediately afterwards. So that school of thought says we're going to get a deep recession, but we're also going to get a very sharp upturn afterwards. That is called the V-shaped recovery. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought says no. Well, actually, this downturn will cause permanent damage to the economy, and we're going to have a prolonged slowdown before we get any recovery. And the argument behind this is as follows. It says that, the virus might cause a short-term sudden stop in the economy. Everything stops. But then once it disappears, it doesn't mean that everything will go back to normal. Because if it lasts for 2 or 3 months, very few businesses can last with no revenue for 2 to 3 months. Very few people can last with no income for 2 to 3 months. So what you might get a large number of bankruptcies by firms. You might get a large number of people being laid off. And in the case of the GCC, for example, where the labor market relies on a large number of people, immigrant workers, these workers might leave the GCC, and it's not easy to restart everything once the virus ends. So we have two schools of thought. That one that says we're going to get a sharp but quick recovery, and the other one says we're going to get a prolonged slowdown. We started initially, the consensus started initially thinking that we're going to get the V-shaped recovery, but now it's shifting more and more towards a prolonged slowdown. That's on the global economy, and it's probably the case on the GCC. Now, what should you do to prevent a prolonged slowdown? What should policy do? What should the policy response be to prevent a slowdown? Well, if the slowdown is going to come from a large number of bankruptcies and layoffs, the government should intervene by preventing these bankruptcies and layoffs. It should support businesses. It should encourage businesses to keep their workers. And in the case of the GCC, it should basically discourage people from leaving the country very quickly. And this is what we've seen in the G20. The G20 is the group of the biggest 20 countries in the world. We've seen announcements of large, what is called stimulus measures. You can see the white bars here. You can see the US is just injecting a huge amount of stimulus, the same thing in Australia, Canada, the UK, and so on. There's one standout country here in the G20, which is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is the only country in the G20 that is cutting spending, reducing government spending in the middle of the deepest downturn, probably on record. And I'm showing Saudi Arabia here because it's part of the G20, but other GCC countries are doing the same thing. We've had an announcement from Dubai government on Thursday that's planning to cut spending last Thursday. We've had announcements from Oman that's also planning to do the same thing. And basically what is happening here is the GCC countries, because of declined oil prices, because they're getting less revenue from oil, they are planning to cut spending. Is this the right policy to do? Probably not, because the role of macroeconomic policy, there is one function for macroeconomic policy to do, is basically to smooth economic output. You don't want to have 10% growth one year, and then minus 8% growth the following year. You're better off having 2% growth every year. Make it more predictable, make it more stable. So what should policymakers do? They should spend less when the economy is doing well, and then they should basically spend more when the economy is in a downturn to smooth that cycle. That's better for businesses, that's better for households, and that's better for foreign investments. And that's not happening here because of oil prices. So maybe I should stop at this point and take questions maybe on the virus before I move to oil.
Thank you so much, Ziad. Do you mind unsharing your screen for the next few minutes, and then we can share it again? Ziad, I thought that you would comfort me, but you have alarmed me even more. So Allah ysamhak. But thank you so much for this presentation on the impact of the virus. We've had so many questions. One question I'd like to share is from Julian de Freypon, who is from the European Union. He says, do you think that the establishment of a social safety net for expatriates in GCC countries is something that they should consider in order to retain at least a part of the workforce?
I think that is important, and that is a key question. So, for example, part of the retention of the workforce, we've seen measures in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia decided to do the following. It decided to subsidize the salaries of Saudi employees in the private sector. They excluded expatriates. Now, in Saudi, that might help because the share of expatriates in the labor market in Saudi Arabia is smaller than it is, for example, in the UAE or Qatar. But again, you have a large number of expatriates that work in the labor market. If you don't protect them, then what are you going to get? You're going to get a large exodus of expatriates from the GCC because your visa and your stay here is linked to your work. Is that an attractive thing for the economy? Probably not. You don't want to come out of this crisis with no hospitality sector, no functioning hospitality sector, with no airline, with no functioning transportation. And it takes a while to hire people. I think the general principle for supporting the economy should be the following. If you have a business and that business that was profitable before the virus, you should continue to support it, whether it belongs to an expatriate or whether it belongs to a local, because you should not allow a random sweeping shock like the virus to basically eliminate profitable businesses that could, generate economic boom later on. Maybe later on, once the virus shock disappears, then you can start thinking about, what to pick and choose and what industries are efficient or inefficient. But right now, I think there should be a general principle to support all businesses, especially the ones that were profitable before the virus hit.
I wanted to ask you about the rationale of the GCC cutting spending at this time. Don't we always hear that the GCC has all these big sovereign wealth funds of $1 trillion, $100 billion? Isn't this time now for them to use that money to soften the blow on the GCC economies, and maybe the other states should be doing the same, or they should never touch these sovereign wealth funds and these sovereign wealth funds should be protected no matter what?
No, I think there are different functions for the sovereign wealth fund. One of them is to save for future generations, but one of them is definitely to basically smooth the economic cycle. So when things are going well, you save more in the sovereign wealth fund and you park more of your assets there. When things are in a downturn, then you just withdraw from your assets to support the economy. And I think that's a natural thing to do. Now, the reason why they're not doing it, and you can understand, is that oil prices have collapsed. And one of the problems with the virus is not only the extent of and the depth of the virus, is the uncertainty it creates. If you know this virus will last for 2 to 3 months, then you know how to act exactly. You know whether to support the economy or not. And if you're a business and you have a certain amount of cash reserves, you know what to do. The problem is we don't know. We don't know if this is going to last for a month, 2 months, or 6 months. And that is making people, companies, and countries acting in a cautious way, withholding their assets because they just don't know what's going to happen in the future.
So some of us have heard news of protests in countries around the world. We heard in Jordan, there were also people protesting, asking for the economies to reopen because they believe or they understand or they think that the cost is higher than the cost of shutting down the economy is higher than the cost of containing the virus. And so Mohammed Abu Hassan is saying here, and he's from Saudi Aramco, do you see that the economic shutdown being relaxed because of the potential unprecedented scale of the recession in the region?
I think globally, you will have that sort of tension that will become more visible going forward. Not many people can work from home. I mean, some people are fortunate they can work from home. Some people are half fortunate they could do some of the work from home, but some people it's impossible. If you're a waiter at a restaurant, if you're a gym instructor, if you're a dentist, if you're a hairdresser, you just can't do it. So you're losing that income. And in the absence of a safety net, then you don't have an income. And at some point, after 2 weeks, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, you say, okay, if I go out and work and vote with my feet and just go out for work, there's a 5 or 10% chance I might get the virus, and there's a 5 to 10% chance I might die. But if I stay at home, I'll starve for sure. So I'm just going to take that risk. And I think the longer these containment measures will last, the longer that tension will come into play. And in some societies, we will have that debate definitely very openly going forward.
Okay, Ziad, so we're going to go now into the second part of your presentation, which is the decline of oil. And this decline of oil is not just relevant for GCC countries or for OPEC member countries, but also for the regional countries, whether they were close, whether they were in the Middle East or even further. Many of the GCC states or OPEC producing oil producing countries help other states. So there is economic assistance from the Gulf to Egypt to Jordan to a lot of states in the region. So they are also impacted. So we're going to talk for the next few minutes on the decline of oil. So I'm going to hand over the screen to you. Please enlarge the screen, everybody.
Thank you, Sultan. So let me just now move to oil. So the main reason why you're not getting support from, the main rationale why you're not getting support when you should be getting support from the governments here is the collapse in oil prices. So let me just talk about that for a bit. Because we started the year with oil at $66 per barrel. We ended the first quarter on the 31st of March with oil at 26. That's a $40 decline. That's a huge amount of decline in oil prices. If you think about countries in the GCC, but also beyond Iraq and Iran, the main export is oil. The main source for government revenue is oil. Oil funds a lot of economic activity. So, construction is funded by oil money. Services are funded by oil money. So before we just discuss oil, let me just perspective on the global economy. Why is oil prices declining? In general, they decline because of two reasons, and oil is getting the perfect storm. So the first reason why oil prices would decline is because you have a shortage of demand. And we do have a massive unprecedented shortage of demand. When you're working from home, you're not commuting, and that accounts for a huge part of global oil demand. Not many, most air travel has been halted, and that accounts for a huge part of oil demand. So out of the $40 decline in oil prices between the beginning of the year and end of March, we basically estimate that about $22 are due to shortage of demand, and that's coming from the coronavirus. But also oil has faced a perfect storm, because what typically happens when you have a shortage of demand is that oil producing countries get together and they decide to cut supply. And that basically supports prices a little. The problem is a month ago, they sat down and they couldn't agree, Saudi Arabia and Russia, and the agreement fell apart. And what that resulted in, everyone started producing beyond capacity. So you have a lot of oil in the market and you have not much demand for it. And that's a perfect storm for oil, which led to a collapse in oil prices. So that's the reason. Now, the good thing is part of the supply component, the fact that they entered into a market share war by flooding the market, will probably just disappear now, because they had a meeting on Thursday, the OPEC and Russia and other countries, and they had agreed to cut oil production by 10 million barrels a day, which is a huge amount. Mexico is a holdout, so Mexico threw a spanner in the works, but that's probably a hurdle that's probably going to be overcome at some point. And then you're probably going to get participation from other countries. So the supply part might disappear, but the demand will stay with us. We're not commuting, we're not traveling, we're not using airplanes, and therefore the decline in oil prices will probably be permanent, at least for the next, this year and next year, because the demand side will remain with us. Still, if you remove some of the supply, at least you end up with oil at 40 or 35, which is far better than 20 or 50. It's not as good as 65, but it's better than 20 or 15. But the problem is you have basically, you have built your budgets based on oil at 55 to 65. And you have gotten used to life of oil at 50. So what's going to happen when oil is at 30 or 35? Well, again, the same principle, which is basically measuring what is unknown by what is known and measuring what is absent by what is present. We know what happens to the GCC when oil prices decline. We have seen that. We have seen that recently in 2014. We know 2014 was a turning point in GCC economies because then oil prices declined from $100 per barrel to $50 per barrel. And that was a huge shock to the GCC. So what happened then is we had a turning point, we had growth declined. So growth in the GCC declined from 6.7% before 2014 to a third of that level, about 2.5%, to a quarter, 2.5%, which is huge decline. These are abstract numbers, but let me just give you some perspective. If you're growing at 6.7%, you essentially double your income every 10 years. If you're growing at 2.5%, you're doubling your income every 30 years. So it takes you 3 times as long to double your income. And that matters for individuals and that matters for companies. It's a massive slowdown. And we've had that after 2014. Do we expect the world to be different this time around? Not really. The GCC is still reliant on oil. You'd expect an oil price shock of that magnitude to have the same impact on the economies. And if anything, the impact will probably be larger today than it was in 2014 because of this. So I'll explain that, but just basically, roughly speaking, the white graph is the state of the GCC economy, different metrics, the state in 2014 before the oil price shock in 2014. And the orange chart, or the orange graph, is the state of the GCC economies on different metrics in 2019 before the 2020 shock. The closer you are to the interior, the worse off you are. So you can see on every single economic metric, the GCC is worse off today than it was in 2013. We know 2014 was painful, so you'd expect 2020 to also be at least equally painful. I'm sorry, Sultan was looking for good news, but I'll keep delivering bad ones. So what are these metrics? The metrics are basically the reserves, how much savings you have, both at the central bank and at the sovereign wealth funds. The metrics are basically the growth rate. The metrics is basically the level of debt. And the metrics are basically the deficit that you're running. So now growth is slower, your savings are lower than 2013, your deficits are wider, and your debt is larger. So on every single metric, you're worse off, and you're less able to withstand a lower output. Your starting point is worse, and therefore the outcome will probably be also worse. Now, what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at the GCC on aggregate. So on aggregate, it's weaker, but within individual countries in the GCC and within different oil producers in the Middle East, they have different strengths and weaknesses. And this is what the next chart shows. What the next chart shows, that shows you who's most vulnerable to the oil price decline. Because some countries are okay, despite being weaker in 2013, they're still fine. And that includes the ones on the right, basically, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. But some are vulnerable. These are the ones on the left, and these are Bahrain, Oman, Iraq, and Iran. So what happened to, for example, Bahrain, Oman, and Iraq after 2014? Well, Bahrain and Iraq had to seek external support. Iraq had to seek external support from the IMF. It got a loan from the IMF to support the economy in 2016 after the collapse of oil price in 2014. And Bahrain had to go to the GCC and get a financial aid package of $10 billion from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, and from Kuwait. Do you expect the same dynamics to happen here? Again, measuring what is known by measuring what is unknown by what is known. This time won't be different. Oman is the big question mark because Oman basically managed to stumble along unscathed after 2014. I say unscathed, it managed, its debt ballooned from, near zero to 60% of GDP in the space of 5 years. It went from 0 to 60 in 5 years. And Oman is always a question mark that people ask about, whether it will need support from its neighbors or from international organizations. And it's a question mark because it's bigger than Bahrain. If 10 billion is enough for Bahrain for 5 years, Oman, 10 billion will last it for only 1 year. And obviously everyone is weaker today. So whether they will be able to support their neighbor or not is a question mark. So just to summarize the virus and oil before I move on to the long-term development stuff, what we do know is that we know the virus is spreading. We know its economic impact is very painful, is very deep. We don't know how long it will last for. We know that oil prices have dropped, and the drop is going to last us for a while. And we know the impact of the oil prices is going to be painful on GCC economies. We know the right policy response is to support the economy now, but we know that we haven't seen that yet. So maybe I hand over to Sultan for a new set of questions before I move on to the long-term stuff.
Let me share your screen, please. Ziad, there's so many questions. First of all, there's over 270 people on this talk. I usually host art talks, but clearly people are very interested in the economic impact. All of us are hurting, no matter where we come from, and there are people in this room from many countries around the world. One thing I would say, there was a question from someone here, Hassan Sharara, I think, yes, Hussein Sharara, who's from Georgetown University, and if you could just answer very briefly, because I want to take more questions from the audience. He's talking about how difficult is it to assess the economic impact of the pandemic and on the oil when the countries really, let's face it, in the region aren't very forthcoming with economic data. Should they be more open?
Yes, we don't have real-time data, but on the pandemic, we have real-time data from elsewhere in the world. And from this region, we know what happened in 2014. And if we expect different dynamics, we need to know why. So we try and track as much data as possible, whatever is being published. We also try and approximate that by what we've seen in the past or what we see elsewhere.
This is a question from Sarah Mohammadi, who's an entrepreneur, and she says, do you foresee the GCC currencies depegging from the dollar because the US is going into a recession?
So there's two questions here. One question is the peg to the dollar the right arrangement? Absolutely the right arrangement now. With so much uncertainty, in normal times it is the right arrangement, now even more so, because with so much uncertainty taking place, you don't want to add another level of uncertainty about what the currency is going to be. The second question is, can you sustain it or not? Some countries can. We're talking about Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and probably Saudi Arabia for the next couple of years. But there's a question mark about Bahrain. It will get support from its neighbors. And there's a question mark about Oman. So it should be preserved if it's possible, but there's a question mark about the capability of preserving the peg.
So we have Reem Al-Jamali from Qatar, who's asking that it seems that there is an agreement coming up for the oil prices to be stabilized. Wouldn't that help?
It helps. It partially helps because, as I said, there are two forces that are basically leading to the collapse in oil prices. There's a lot of supply and there is not much demand. Removing supply helps, but the amount of let me just give you some numbers just to make it concrete. We're losing somewhere. So the world consumes every day about 100 million barrels of oil. Every day, because of demand, because we're working from home, because there's no flights, we're losing, we don't know yet, but somewhere between 20 to 35 million barrels a day. So we're losing 20 to 35% of demand for oil on a daily basis. The supply agreement is to cut about 10. So you're still short about 10 to 15. So yes, you're removing some supply and that will support prices a little, but you still have a massive shortfall in demand. So
there's a question, I'm sorry, I have to take this question, and this is from my brother. So if I don't ask it, then I get in trouble, who's my chairman. So he says, do you think it's time to invest in oil companies now?
Well, if you want to diversify away from oil, maybe there is a rationale behind this, but if you want to use your savings to basically be less linked to oil, then don't invest in oil companies. I think that's sort of the straightforward answer. There might be something more complicated that my simple-minded brain doesn't capture. But I think if you want to move away from oil, don't invest in oil.
Great, don't invest in oil. Okay, so we have a question from Mohammed Al-Saad who's saying, we see a major rebound in the US stock markets due to monetary measures. They decreased the interest rate. What happens when liquidity is high, but economic activity is low?
So what happens in a crisis, and this is a very actually important and good question. What happens in a crisis is that people hoard liquidity. So you just become very cautious. You don't spend as much, you increase your savings. And that happens on a personal level, that happens on a company level, that happens at banks, and that happens at governments. So what is happening now is that, as mentioned, the central banks are injecting a lot of liquidity. They're printing a lot of money, basically, just to make that simple. And they're giving that to banks, but banks are hoarding them. They're just staying with that liquidity because they're worried about the future. If you have a problem in the future, it's good to have cash. to protect you against it. And that's what everyone is doing. So in times of crisis, people want to hoard cash as much as possible. And that's why central banks inject a lot of liquidity into the system. Just one more thing. In the US, they could do this. In the GCC, they can't because they have a currency pegged to the US dollar. So the amount of money printing that you could do is constrained by the fact that you have a currency peg.
So this is a question from Salah Al-Muhammadi. It's the last question I will take before we move to the last part of the presentation. It's a question I had already also written. And what should the GCC countries do now to offset the crisis and diversify their economies away from oil?
Okay, so right now you're in a crisis management mode. Now is not the time to do, thoughtful long-term stuff. Now is just, putting out fire. And putting out fire, I think the general principle, when we can discuss detail, the general principle is that save companies that are profitable. Think about a company like Careem, which started in 2012. If this has happened in 2013, and Careem is a success story because it ended up being sold to Uber, and it's a success regional story. If this crisis happened in 2013, impacting the transport sector, Careem would have died at inception. And we know that's a good story. We know that's a successful company and was a successful company. So think about the number of companies that are dying out because of this. So the general principle, any company that was profitable before the pandemic should be saved. And later on, think about consolidation, think about diversification, think about what needs to be done in a more thoughtful, rational manner. But now it's crisis management.
Okay, Ziad, so I'll hand over the screen back to you. Do you mind enlarging your presentation to the maximum possible as well?
I'll do that. The last section is shorter, so maybe we'll have more time for more questions at the end. Let me just share the screen first. And then go Max. Okay. I'm unable to go Max. Let me just try again. Maximize the screen before.
No problem, no problem.
1 second. Let me try one more thing and then no, it's not working. So I'll have to do with that. If there's anything, I can explain it verbally. Sorry about this. So the last thing I want to talk about, so we talked a lot about the short term, what is happening here and now in the crisis management. But there's also a broader context to this. There's a broader political and social context to this in the region and globally. And in the region in particular, and here I'm going to actually go out completely the GCC, I'm going to talk about MENA. What we have is that every single Arab republic has had mass protests since 2011. So this came in 2 waves. The first wave had 6 countries, Mauritania, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria. And then we had the second wave last year, which is basically Iraq, Lebanon, Algeria, and Sudan. And the common question we get, and we ask ourselves all the time, is that will this lead to something better or not? And that is basically a very vague question. So in order to make it more precise, I'm using basically a theoretical framework from a couple of political economists. They wrote a book that's called Why Nations Fail. One of them is Daron Acemoglu, who's a famous economist. And the second one is James Robinson, who's also a famous political economist. And in fact, James Robinson was here in Dubai a year ago presenting at the World Government Summit. So they wrote a book called Why Nations Fail in 500 pages. I can summarize it in one statement. And that statement is as follows. Long-term economic development happens if you have the right political institutions. So what are the right political institutions? These are institutions that have 2 properties. One of them is that they are pluralistic, so they allow a wide distribution of power in society. And the second one is that they must be stable. So you don't have, violence, coups, etc. And the theory behind this is why do you need these for economic development? Well, economic development happens because of a process that economists call creative destruction. So basically, people innovate, they find new and better ways of doing things, which displace old and obsolete way of doing things. And that creates better, economic surplus for everyone. And that's how the economies grow. So why do you need political institutions for this? Well, they argue that without pluralism, if you don't have a pluralistic political systems, then basically you have systems that rely on patronage, on monopolies, and these are not conducive to economic development and that process of innovation and creative destruction. And the second condition, without political stability, then you don't have rule of law and you don't have property rights. And again, that doesn't help the process of creative destruction and innovation. So the question is then, so we know that for long-term economic development, we need inclusive, what they call inclusive political institutions, which means they are pluralistic and they are also stable. So the question we ask, will the protests in the Arab world lead to something better, is we could specify that and make it more precise. Will they lead to better economic institutions or political institutions? Will they lead to inclusive political institutions that are pluralistic and stable? So we've had two waves of Arab protests. The ones in 2019 is too early to judge. We've only had a few months since Iraq and Lebanon and Algeria and Sudan have started. But the class of 2011, we've had a few years and we could judge them. So what I did in this chart is basically I attached a score to each of these countries, and the scores come, the pluralism score comes from the democracy index from the Economist intelligence unit. So it gives a democracy score to each country. And then the stability score, the World Bank basically has a political stability index. They give a numeric score to how politically stable each country is. And then I divided that plane into 4 quadrants. So on the top left, you have countries that are stable but not democratic. And I call these authoritarian. So this is most of the Arab countries in 2010, most of the Arab republics here in 2010 were in that quadrant. The top right quadrant is you have countries that are democratic and stable, and that's basically dreamland for Acemoglu and Robinson, and that's basically what they call inclusive political institutions. The bottom right quadrant is where you have countries that are democratic, but not stable. So that's basically Lebanon, Iraq in 2018, and I call these chaotic, for lack of better terms. And if you get offended by this, then wait till you see the next one. The bottom left quadrant is countries that are not stable, not democratic, and I call them failed states. So what happened to the 6 countries that had mass protests in 2011? Where did they move to? Did they move to a better state of institutions, or did they move to a worse state of institutions? Well, out of the 6 countries, only 1 country has managed to move towards inclusive political institutions, and that's Tunisia. So Tunisia, you had an increase in pluralism. It increased in pluralism so much without sacrificing stability by a lot. So it moved towards inclusive political institutions. Other countries that had the 2011 sort of protests, they have either remained authoritarian or they moved to failed states. So that tells you a few things. One of them is that it's very difficult to create these inclusive political institutions. Only one of 6 countries have managed to do it in our region. But the second thing, and that's actually a broader discussion, both for the region and also for the global economy, is how does this interact with the coronavirus? We already have this social and political sort of movement taking place in the background. How does this interact with the coronavirus? Because the coronavirus is also presenting us, not just here, but globally, with a lot of questions. This is a virus that's global, and we have a globalized economy, and we have set up our political systems, our economies, and our societies to be globalized societies. After the virus, do we want to maintain that, or do we want to give this up? And different countries will answer these questions differently. Some of them will want to remain open. Others might decide to basically become more isolationist. There's also questions about personal freedoms. Even in liberal societies, we're hearing about governments that are basically using personal data to trace contacts in order to contain the virus. And that's acceptable in a time when you have a pandemic. But will society decide to accept this as a permanent state of affairs? Or will it decide to basically suspend this power only in emergencies? And in fact, this is what, Darren Acemoglu had actually a seminar much like this one, a webinar a couple of days ago, and he called this, the virus, he called this a critical juncture. A critical juncture is when countries with sort of small differences, they make very different decisions on these big questions, because such a big sweeping event like the virus will present us with big questions. and they end up with very different institutions down the road, and they end up with very different economic paths for economic development down the road. Actually, one of the examples they give in the book is the Black Death in the 1300s. It led to different institutional reactions in Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe, and that led to subsequent different political institutions in Western versus Eastern Europe, and that led to different paths of development in Western versus Eastern Europe. So what I'm trying to say here, just going beyond the short term, in the long term, we already have in a region that's in flux, and the virus is presenting us with a lot of questions that will have not only consequences for the next month, year or two, but for decades to come, depending how we answer them.
Okay, Ziad, we have so many questions. Please close the presentation so that we have your face منور الشاشة. First question I'll take from Zaina Matar. How do you think this crisis will reshape capitalist societies versus socialist societies? Is this the death of capitalism?
So I have very little interest and expertise in ideological sort of questions. Whenever I get asked that question, I then ask the question, what is capitalism? And then it just becomes half an hour debate about the definition. Let me just give one answer on this, and I think this is what I could just give a flavor. One role of market economies is they give us information. When we have prices that are high, it tells us there's a shortage of supply relative to demand, and it tells us also market is a way to allocate this shortage of supply by allowing the person who values the thing most, who is willing to pay more price for it, to obtain that object. Now, one thing in which we need to probably suspend market economies is in the current crisis. We don't need prices to tell us there's a shortage of ventilators and masks and medical equipment. And we know that. We don't need the prices to skyrocket for us to understand this. We certainly don't need a market mechanism to allocate the shortage of ventilators. We don't want the richest to basically be able to get these and the poorest not to be able to. So I think one way in which we should be suspending market economies is this case. Because we know there's a shortage of medical equipment. We know that the fair allocation of these shortages is not the people who are most able to pay should be getting it. We need a different mechanism. And I think on that front, I'm fully agreement that, I fully agree that we need mechanisms other than market allocation mechanisms to allocate these things.
Okay, so the next question is from someone you also know, Financial Times correspondent Simeon Kerr, who asks, what is the prognosis for Dubai? The UAE may be less vulnerable, but Dubai's economy is particularly exposed. Will it be able to cope with the steep downturn and debt obligations without relying on support?
Without relying on?
Support.
Well, that's a good question. Look, everyone is having issues and everyone's having problems. And the question is, how do you deal with that? We know from previous crises it needed support, but it's also how do you react to this pandemic and to this decline in oil prices. We talk about Dubai as a diversified economy, and it is, because Dubai does not produce much in terms of oil or gas. Dubai produces everything else: tourism, real estate, financial services, other services. But let's also remember, Dubai is reliant on oil because although it's producing non-oil goods and services, its main clients are in the region, and its main clients' incomes come from oil and gas. And if your client's income is halved because oil prices has halved, naturally that impacts you as a country. So there's a limit to diversification within this region and within this geography. And there's, we need to think about a way about how to, even though you manage to diversify, you're still in a region that's largely not diversified. So what do you do then? Do you actually approach other markets and make sure that you have, the Chinese and Indians and stuff as your main clients? Or what do you do in that case? It's not an easy question. Diversification is not easy because we haven't had historical experiences that tells us how to do this. But that's a question that's actually, we're going to see the answer for.
So this is another question that was seconded by a lot of people. Imad Atwi asks, one way to look at this pandemic is as a big data issue. What key data is missing, and what can governments and private sector companies do to bring that data and start building tailored solutions?
Well, we need more data on everything. We need a more collection of data, and this region definitely falls far behind anywhere else in the world. Let me give you an example. So of the 6 countries in the GCC, Saudi Arabia publishes an amazing labor force survey. It tells us how many people are employed, how many people are unemployed, what jobs do they do, which regions. The problem with that is that it just comes out with a huge amount of delay. The last labor force survey we have is from the 3rd quarter of 2019. So by the time we get to Q1, we need to wait 6 to 9 months for the new data to tell us what's happening right now. And that's a long time for policymakers, for businesses to make decisions. So A, other countries need to actually start collecting this data and publish it, but B, they should publish that on a more timely basis. Secondly, the way we collect the data, and by that, let me just talk about the main economic indicator, which is called GDP. And that's globally. GDP was designed in World War II to collect, it's a world concept. It's a world concept. And the world concept that's based on factories and how many goods they produce. For a service economy, it's not as good. And globally, there's a whole debate about moving to other measures of measuring economic activity that are more service-oriented, that are faster to collect. We're seeing innovations in France where they're telling us what is happening in real time. But in this region, we need A, to basically catch up with the rest of the world, and B, publish definitely more timely indicators, because we're completely in the dark, and that's not helpful for businesses, and that's not helpful for governments.
So, I mean, we have such a lively chat, Ziad. I really feel that it's a very difficult exercise for me to pick questions. I had a question that was seconded. Ghalib Samara and Riyadh Jukka and some others asked about the real estate and construction sector in the UAE, and other people are asking about the healthcare sector, asking about certain sectors, hospitality sectors. Do you have any prognosis of what's happening?
So I'm a macroeconomist. I deal with the overall economy. I don't deal with certain sectors. But as an observer, we know there was an issue with real estate here. We all saw that. We all experience that every day when we're negotiating our rents or our housing. And there's already a problem with that, in that you have excess supply. And that's, again, something that happened after 2014. This is a key issue here, because if you allow a large exodus of people to leave the country, then that problem will basically become even bigger. You already have issues there. And if a large number of people lose their jobs and leave the country, then it just becomes even bigger. It's the same thing with hospitality. If you don't get support there, we may not end up with our favorite restaurant in existence. Same thing with hotels. I think we need definitely support, even in countries where you're having the support. In the UK, which is this amazing, stimulus package over there, you hear about, hotels that are being shut, people are being suspended and being laid off. And you expect the same dynamics to be in place here. Without government support, this is where governments need to intervene, policymaking needs to intervene to ensure that when you come out of the pandemic, you have a functioning hospitality sector, you have a functioning transport sector, and you have a functioning services sector.
So I'm going to exercise nepotism once again and take 2 quick questions from my previous students at Yale University. Selma Shaheen asks, which industries do you think will flourish from this crisis? And that's Selma Shaheen. And Ahmed Gubba in Singapore is asking, is there a risk that the states in the MENA will start to fend for themselves and put up trade barriers, maybe like some other countries have been doing? And is that the wrong strategy?
Okay, so on the second question, let me just start with the second question, because I remember that my short-term memory is not great. On the second question, the GCC by nature are open economies. What they do at a very basic level, and this is completely reductionist, is that they export oil and gas and they import everything else. Again, very reductionist. So for that model to survive and to sustain, you need an open economy, and that's unlikely to change as long as your main product is oil and gas. So no, I don't think that will change. On the first question, which sectors will thrive or not? Again, I'm not an expert in sectors. I'm an expert in overall economies. But even in the deepest of downturns, even in wars, some people thrive and some businesses thrive. But the issue is, overall the economies do add up. So you can thrive for the short term if, for example, you're a food delivery, if you're a food delivery business. But then if people leave, if restaurants shut down, you thrive for the short term, but in the long term, you'll have issues. I think what matters here is that when you have large parts of the economy are coming down, they bring everything down with them. We know there are certain sectors that are at the frontier of this crisis, and these are transport and hospitality. But we know there's also a domino effect, and everyone will be impacted by this.
So maybe the penultimate question, a gentleman called Kasra Farivari asked about the economic impact on large economies such as Egypt, which rely heavily on cash inflows, remittances, tourism, manufacturing, exports. But also maybe I'd like to add to Kasra's question that the GCC is heavily invested in Egypt's stabilization and other countries' stabilization, but at this time they aren't able to fund these countries to that extent. So I think they find themselves in a bind that they want to support their allies, but at the same time, they have dwindling reserves, cash reserves to do so.
Sure. So at the risk of being boring and keeping repeating myself, I'll again resort to the 2014 experience. What happened in 2014? Egypt was supported by the GCC. Oil prices dropped. GCC was less able to support Egypt. Egypt had to go to the IMF to ask for help. This happened in 2016. So they had to devalue the currency, they had high inflation and so on. Now, in theory, you think a country like Egypt, Jordan, or Lebanon, they import oil, so a decline in oil prices is good for them. But as Sultan mentioned, they also rely on remittances from their workers in the GCC, and these decline. They also rely on tourism from oil exporting countries, and these have declined. So Egypt will be struggling as a result of oil, but certainly will be also have issues because of the pandemic, because it relies on services, because it relies on tourism. And we've seen first signs of this. So a few days ago, I was given a seminar and I'm just saying, look, Egypt is fun because they have large amount of reserves, and showing my lack of foresight and my ignorance the day after they published their reserves number. So one reason why they're strong is because they have saved, after the IMF program, a lot of money. They saved about $45 billion, which is sizable for Egypt. But we discovered that they lost 5 billion of that in March because there's a lot of outflows and they had to support the currency. So even that large sort of war chest was exhausted, not exhausted completely, but you lost a large part of that in a single month. And if the pandemic continues for a long time, it might have issues.
So maybe just before ending, Abdullah Al-Farsi, who's studying at the University of Washington, he asked about Oman, but maybe look at the region as a whole. What should be the turnaround plans? Dr. Ziad Daoud, now you are hereby appointed the economic advisor to the regional states. Okay, what are the one or two pieces of economic advice would you give them? What should they do? What should they not do? Maybe.
Okay, so in the short term, a few things. In the short term, agree on oil production cuts, support prices a little. Secondly, support businesses. After the pandemic is over, so you need to increase spending now. After the pandemic is over, think about how to balance the books. But there's an important thing, because we keep having recurrence of crises. Every time oil prices drop, we have the same issue and the same chat. And in between, we talk about diversification. If you're serious about diversification, there are certain things that need to be done. And frankly, I have not seen them been done yet. What are these things? Two things. The litmus tests are two things, and I'm going to be very frank here. One, we need to liberalize the labor market. You need to make restrictions in the labor market. You need to make the labor market less restrictive. And I'm not saying this. If you look at what businesses say, so the World Economic Forum, which organizes the Davos meeting every year, they ask businesses from every country, what are the biggest hurdles of doing business in your country? And if you look at the GCC, it's very clear the top complaints are about the labor market. People complain about the restrictive labor market. So you have all these nationalization ratios, limits on expatriates and so on. They complain about the inability to find adequately educated workforce, and they complain about work ethic. You need to fix the labor market. It's very clear, it's problematic. That's definitely an issue that needs fixing. The second thing, you need to fix your foreign ownership laws. No business is going to come into the region or very few businesses will come into the region where you have a local partner that owns 51% of the business. Now, there's a partial solution to this. We've seen that in Dubai, we've seen that in other countries because the example was successful, which is the concept of free zones. So you create free zones where businesses can come, foreign investors can come and have businesses they fully own with relaxed labor restrictions, and basically that operate, that thrives. We at Bloomberg, we operate out of the IFC, Dubai International Financial Center, and that's a free zone because Mark Bloomberg owns 100% of the, Bloomberg owns 100% of the company, there's no local partner, and we don't have restrictions on labor. So I think these things need to be addressed, but also these are not straightforward. There's a political dimension to this which need to be addressed as well.
So increase in spending, stabilizing oil, political dimension that we won't mention. The last thing I would say is Mo Shafi'i from Canada says, we need some good news. What's the silver lining in this dark time? Give us some good news, just one good news, Ziad, please.
One good news, okay. Look, this is a disruptive event. And disruptive events, things can go in different directions. Who knows what's gonna happen next? I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen in 1 month or 2 months. But this is a big, drastic, sweeping event. It might lead to big, drastic, sweeping decisions, which might lead to a better state going forward. You might need, a shock to shake you up and then make you do something that is difficult, and that leads you to something better. It's very difficult to reform and do the right thing when you relax, but when your back is up against the wall, you might be forced to do the right thing.
Ziad Daoud, Chief Economist at Bloomberg, thank you so much for joining us. There were 270 plus people in this chat for the past hour, many of whom really aren't interested in economics in general, but I believe that you successfully managed to simplify and explain to us the state of the region and certain countries in the Middle East as well. Thank you so much. I will save the chat and I will email it to you because there's a lot of questions that you might want to address. I will also end the meeting in a few minutes so that you guys have a chance to connect with each other in case you wanted to get each other's emails. Thank you so much, Ziad, and thank you all for joining us. I'll be posting soon. By the way, I'm doing an arts talk every Wednesday and a non-arts talk every Saturday. So there is some kind of method to this madness that's going on. Thank you so much, Ziad. See you.
Thank you very much, Sultan, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.